Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Regulatory Affairs webinar on the new novel foods regulation, what has changed, really focusing as well on the question, is your product or an ingredient, is it a novel ingredient? The purpose of this presentation is to summarise the recent EU legislation on novel foods, which applied from the 1st of January this year, and also to provide you with guidance as to whether your ingredient or product could be considered as novel under the new rules. Regulation was published in 2015 and replaced the previous regulation from 1997 and is applicable in all member states. The new regulation differs significantly from its predecessor in terms of the definition of novel food and the authorisation process. I will be considering the extended scope of the definition and the new authorisation procedure and evaluations for traditional foods from third countries, which will be more efficient and make their access to the EU market easier. The new regulation updates the old legislation to simplify the procedures and to take account of recent developments in technological progress. In terms of transition measures, for those applications which were submitted under the previous regulation and for which a final decision had not been taken before the application of this regulation, risk assessment and authorisation procedures will be concluded in accordance with the new regulation, and these transitional measures are laid down. Okay, so looking at the concept of novel food, in terms of the scope of the regulation, it does in principle remain the same as the previous scope. However, the categories have been reviewed, clarified and updated. So you'll find the definition of novel food in Article 3 of the 2015 regulation. So novel food is considered to be any food or food ingredient that was not used for human consumption to a significant degree, which is quite an important term of words there, within the EU before the 15th of May 1997, the date when the first regulation on novel foods came into force. And that falls under at least one of a number of categories, and I'll be talking about those categories in the next couple of slides. Focusing here on the word significant degree, but these words aren't actually defined in the regulation. However, the European Commission has published guidance on this, and this discusses issues such as the food having an established history of use in at least one member state. It looks at typical levels of consumption, also whether that food is part of a normal diet by the average population, and its availability on the market. So all these factors should be considered when considering whether something has been consumed to a significant degree. So that's the first thing that needs to be met. In addition, a novel food must fall into one of the defined categories. The previous regulation had 4 categories of novel food. However, the new regulation includes an enlarged number of categories of 10. I will now run through these categories. Okay, so looking at the first one on the slide here, food with a new or intentionally modified molecular structure. This is principally the same as what was in the old regulation. An example of one of these types of food is salad trims and reduced energy fat. The second point on the slide here, I have combined a number of the categories together just for ease really. So we've got foods consisting of, isolated from or produced from microorganisms, fungi, algae, material of mineral origin, plants or their parts, animals and their parts, cell culture or tissue culture. So you can see here that there are a number of different types of products covered. This category comprises a number of categories in the regulation which I've combined, as I said. There are new categories within this bullet point here for foods of mineral origin and also cell and tissue culture. Also, the wording for the other categories have been expanded to include the words produced from and consisting of for animals. So this is quite important, which means that now insects themselves fall within the scope of this category, whereas previously only ingredients isolated from animals would have been within the scope. The third category bullet point on this slide is foods, novel foods such as UV-treated bread, where it's been treated with UV radiation to increase the vitamin D content. So this is a food which has been produced from a production process that wasn't currently used for food production in the EU before the 15th of May 1997, and which gives rise to significant changes in the compositional structure of a food, affecting, obviously in this case, its nutritional value, metabolism or level of undesirable substances. So that's the same category that used to be in the old regulation. There are a number of foods which are already authorised that have been produced in this way. Now, all the entries on this slide here are the new categories for novel foods. So, firstly, foods consisting of engineered nanomaterials. Now, this regulation removes the definition of engineered nanomaterial from the Food Information to Consumers regulation, so the labelling provisions, and moved it into the Novel Foods regulation. So the definition of a nanomaterial concerns intentionally produced or engineered nanomaterials with one or more dimensions of 100 nanometers or composed of distinct parts which have dimensions of 100 nanometers or less. So it's very small materials. Also, the second point here, vitamins, minerals and other substances, again, which are produced using a production process that wasn't used for food production within the EU before May 1997, also that may consist or contain of engineered nanomaterials. So that's a new category. And the final point here is food used exclusively in food supplements before the 15th of May, where it's now intended to be used in foods in general, so other than food supplements. So that was now within the scope of the legislation. So I've put some examples on the slide here of novel foods that are already authorised. So I mentioned earlier about the UV-treated mushrooms to increase the vitamin D content, chia seeds in various products, noni fruit, the juice itself, fruit juice powder, and the leaves of the plant. So they've all been authorised as novel foods. And whole crickets and powder are examples of novel foods but haven't yet been approved. But we'll come on to insects later. I'll explain a bit more about the implications for those. Now, the main changes with the new regulation, obviously there have already been changes to the definition of a novel food, but in terms of some of the other changes, applications for authorisation of novel foods, which were previously assessed in a decentralised process, whereas the individual member states looked at the novel food, they will now be centrally assessed by the European Food Safety Authority, or EFSA. The previous approval process was characterised as a long and a certain time-consuming and expensive procedure. However, the review of the Novel Foods Regulation has considerably simplified this system. So all novel foods that have been authorised in the past are now on the Union list, can be marketed as such. All the safety evaluations, say, will be carried out by EFSA, and all the authorisations that were previously authorised are now generic instead of applicant-specific, which means that any food business operator can market a novel food which is already on the list, provided that they meet the conditions of use, the labelling requirements and any post-monitoring requirements that need to be met. The new regulation also introduces a more appropriate assessment procedure for traditional foods coming into the EU from third countries, so that's countries outside of the EU member states. If the traditional food in question can be demonstrated as being historically safe in that country and there are no safety concerns raised by the EU member states or EFSA, that traditional food will be allowed to be placed on the market on the basis of a notification. And we'll come back to this. So it's not an authorisation, it's a notification procedure which is less time consuming. The regulation also includes data protection provisions which can guarantee that newly developed scientific data and proprietary data cannot be used for the benefit of another application for 5 years after the novel food has been authorised. However, this is not available to notifications or applications to place traditional foods on the EU market. So I mentioned the Union list of novel foods. So this has subsequently been published in a Commission regulation, 2017-2470. It's a very lengthy document because it has all the novel foods that have been previously authorised listed in one complete document. Came into force on the 19th of January this year, and obviously it contains all authorised novel foods and will be continually updated as newly developed novel foods and traditional foods from third countries with a history of safe use are authorised and will subsequently appear on the list. In fact, since its publication in December last year, it has already been amended 4 times, including products taxiful-enriched extract in dairy products and also an extract of 3 herbal roots for use in food supplements. So there are already amendments to this regulation. Once a product, a novel food, appears on the list, the regulation will also stipulate if there are any additional labelling requirements, for example, regarding the name of the novel food and also any warning statements that may be required. And there are specifications as well in the second part of the annex to the regulation for some novel foods. The underlying principles of the safety of novel foods are outlined in Article 7 of the regulation. So novel foods may only be authorised if the food does not, on the basis of scientific evidence, pose a safety risk to human health. That the food's intended use does not mislead the consumer, especially when it's intended to replace another food where there's a significant change in the nutritional value. And finally, where the food is intended to replace another food, it does not differ in such a way that its normal consumption would be nutritionally disadvantageous. So obviously, allergen implications have to come into consideration when the novel food is assessed. However, before a novel food can be safety assessed and authorised, a food business operator must first decide whether a food is novel in the first instance. So how does a food business operator go about this? The Novel Foods Regulation from 2015 requires that the food business operator verify whether or not the food which they intend to place on the market falls within the scope. Now, there has been an implementing regulation from earlier this year detailing the procedural steps, really, of the consultation process for novel food determination. So food business operators have to provide the necessary information in the first instance to the member state where they first intend to market the novel food to enable that member state to determine whether or not it falls within the scope of the Novel Foods Regulation. And that consultation request has to be submitted electronically to the recipient member state. And the regulation does detail what has to accompany that submission, so looking at a cover letter, technical dossier, supporting documentation, and also an explanatory note. On concluding the novel food status of a food, the recipient member state must then notify the food business operator, must also tell the other member states and the Commission and provide its justification. And the Commission must without delay make that information on the novel food status publicly available. So you'll find that on the Commission's website once a decision has been made. So that's a decision on whether or not an ingredient or a food falls within the scope of the regulation. Once that's been decided and it's decided that a novel food is a novel food, then for most products, business would have to go through the standard authorisation procedure, which is detailed in Article 10 of the regulation. So again, this has to be submitted electronically to the Commission, and the Commission has to make the application available to the Member States, and also make a summary publicly available, which again you can find on the Commission's website. And upon request from the Commission, the European Food Safety Authority must therefore give its opinion on the safety of the novel food. In terms of the applicant is actually defined in the regulation, so the applicant could be a member state. It could be a third country, or it could be the interested food party itself, so the food business operator, which again may represent several interested parties. In terms of the time limits in the procedure, this is actually stipulated in the regulation, and the procedure length is less than it was in the previous regulation. So it's approximately 8 months if no request comes from EFSA. Most requests will go to EFSA for an opinion, and you're looking at about 18 months for the opinion once it's been requested, with the possibility of clock stops if further information is actually requested. Once the EFSA have published an opinion, the Commission will then draft a draft regulation, and then it will go to the Standing Committee for vote. So all the time limits are actually detailed in the regulation itself. Now, the Novel Food Regulation does provide for additional implementing acts to be adopted regarding the content, so what should appear, and the drafting and the presentation of a novel foods application for authorisation, and the type of information also that EFSA must publish in their opinions. Now, this regulation, which was published in 2017, details the information that has to appear, so what scientific documentation must appear to allow the Commission to verify the validity of the authorisation and to enable EFSA to conduct comprehensive risk assessments. So any applications must include detailed descriptions of the safety evaluation strategy that's been undertaken, the raw data, the information on the relevance of the test material, for example, that are used that are assessed in the toxicological studies, and the detection and characterisation test methods for engineered nanomaterials. EFSA have also published guidance on the preparation and presentation of an application, which really presents a common format for the organisation of the information. So they want you to include information on, obviously, the identity of the novel food, its production process, compositional data, history of use, proposed use levels, nutrition information, toxicological information, and so on. They've also published in February this year a completeness checklist to support applicants in the building of your application. So at least you know that you've covered everything that needs to appear in your application. Coming back to traditional foods from third countries, these are defined in Article 3 of the regulation. So traditional food from a third country means a novel food which is derived from primary production with a history of safe food use in a third country. So a history of safe food use in a third country is also defined. This means the safety of the food in question has been confirmed with compositional data and from experience of continued use. So that's important, that it has to be continued use for at least 25 years in the customary diet of a significant number of people in at least one third country. So those are important things to note on that point there. You've got the continued use at least 25 years and a significant number of people in one third country. The history of safe use should not include non-food uses or uses not related to normal diets. Okay, so for traditional foods from third countries, evaluations for such foods are more efficient now, because instead of following the authorisation procedure, which I just talked about, traditional foods from third countries may follow a notification route, which is a shorter process. However, it must be ensured that the quality of evidence meets the requirements of Article 7, which I just talked about. If duly reasoned safety objectives are, however, raised by a member state or by EFSA, then an authorisation procedure must be carried out instead of the notification route, which is similar to the standard procedure but with shorter time frames. Now, there is an option of a joint application to be led by an authority in a third country seeking authorisation through the notification procedure, and this might be quite appropriate really for insect applications. So, for example, the national authorities in countries where insects are traditionally consumed, so Southeast Asia, African countries, may be better placed than the operators themselves, who are often micro-scale farmers. So the national authorities themselves then can gather, collect, aggregate and analyse the data required for the compilation of the notification dossier. And again, EFSA have published, in addition to the implementing regulation for traditional foods, guidance on notification requirements. So again, it helps food manufacturers or third country applicants decide what information must appear in the notification. So this guidance was published in September 2016. So this sets a common format for the organisation of the information that must appear. And the safety of the traditional food must be substantiated by reliable data on its composition, its experience of continued use and its proposed conditions of use. So very similar information is required as for the standard procedure. However, obviously the toxicological information isn't required because that's demonstrated through continued consumption. So a food, for example, that's traditionally consumed only at special occasions in a third country or exclusively used in combination with another food that may cause health concerns when consumed in larger quantities or for a longer duration, may have an issue perhaps if it's cooked or consumed differently by consumers in the EU as compared to that in a third country. So those are the sorts of considerations that need to be thought of. Coming back to the Novel Foods Regulation again, under Article 25 of the regulation, if a food business operator who has already placed a novel food on the market becomes aware of new scientific or technical information which might influence the evaluation of the safety of the use of a novel food, or becomes aware of any prohibition or restriction by a third country, once they become aware of that, it is important that the Commission is informed, and the Commission will then make that information available to the Member States. Also, under Article 24 of the regulation, it requires the Commission may require that post-market monitoring take place as well to see what's happening with the novel foods out on the marketplace. In terms of transitional arrangements, Article 35 of the Novel Foods Regulation lays down transitional arrangements. So any requests that were made for novel food assessments submitted to Member States in accordance with the old regulation and where a final decision had not been taken before the 1st of January this year are now treated as applications under the new regulation. And in the first bullet point here, foods that didn't fall within the scope of the old regulation, so insects is a good example here, which now fall within the scope of the new regulation, may continue to be placed on the market until a decision is made following an application for their authorisation or for a notification from a third country, and no later than the 2nd of January 2020. But that application for notification must be made by the 1st of January next year, so it's not long now for such insect producers to apply or notify the Commission of their intention to place these products on the market as novel foods. Some competent authorities in EU member states, so for example Spain, Poland, Sweden and Italy, refused to grant the benefit of the transitional measure as they consider that whole insects and or their preparations and derived products were already falling within the scope of the old novel foods regulation, and therefore in order to be placed on the market they would have had to have been authorised. Whereas other member states, including the UK, Netherlands, Denmark and Finland, do however consider that whole insects as well as their preparations or derived products were clearly outside the scope and therefore the transitional measures can be applied. So differences in interpretation of the regulation may have implications for the transitional arrangements. In terms of insects, I think it will be quite a developing area. There are some guidance documents available published by the International Platform of Insects for Food and Feed, where they've drafted some guidance and briefing papers setting out the steps really to be followed by insect producers intended to submit an application for authorisation or for a notification. So it provides us guidance really for food business operators who want to place insect products on the market. The main responsibility for submitting an application will generally lie with the insect primary producers who sell the raw material to a subsequent producer for processing. The central role of the insect primary producers in the approval process derives from the fact really that the operators control the farming and the main production processes. EFSA published an opinion in 2015 on the risk profile related to the production and consumption of insects, and this presents looks at really the potential biological and chemical hazards as well as allergen issues and environmental hazards associated with farmed insects used as food and feed. So that's an important document that must obviously be taken into consideration. And final point there, obviously this guidance document also addresses different EU member states' approaches on novel food status of whole insects and their preparations, as I was just talking about. They have different approaches and this might have implications for the transitional arrangements. Looking finally really at a couple of examples of some ongoing applications of novel foods which are going through the system at the moment. So these are some current listings on the Commission website for some ongoing applications. So for example, chia seeds is already permitted in a number of products in the novel food regulation, but an applicant is requesting that the use be extended up to 3% in chocolate and up to 10% in fruit spreads. So that application is going through at the moment. Bacterial cellulose, which is obtained from fermentation, intended to be used in a variety of foods that's traditionally produced in Asian countries at the moment. It's an interesting one, egg membrane, to be used in food supplements. It's already marketed in the USA, and the manufacturer is wanting to bring it into the EU member states as a novel food. Olive leaf extract, so this is a high olive polyphenol olive leaf extract for use in a number of food categories, including milk and dairy products, confectionery, juices and beverages. And the last two here are applications for some insects, so migratory locusts. So this is the heat-treated locust nymphs or adults for consumption as such, or used as an ingredient in certain food groups. So looking at locust flour, confectionery, bakery goods, soups and sauces as some examples there. And finally, dried mealworms, up to 10% in bread, breakfast cereals, chocolate confectionery and salad dressings. So if these all go through, you'll see some interesting ingredient lists on some products in the near future. And in terms of some ongoing notifications, so these are notifications of traditional foods from third countries. So the first one there is a particular type of cereal grain which is indigenous to West Africa, which is used as a substitute for rice. So that could be that's been looked at as a novel food for import into the UK. Hasket berries, this is a UK application. It's commonly consumed in Japan at the moment. And sorghum syrup, this is it's got a history of use as a sweetener in the southern states of the USA. It can be used as a plant-derived sweetener for EU consumption. So these are some of the ongoing notifications that are being looked at. Finally, in terms of enforcement of the EU legislation, because it's an EU regulation, there has to be enforcement provisions laid down in all the EU member states. In the UK, in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, enforcing legislation was published in 2017. In England, it was a bit later in 2018. And what it does is it lays down offences for failure to comply with specified EU provisions. So these are the provisions of the EU Novel Foods Regulations. So offences for placing on the market non-authorised novel foods, failure to not comply with labelling requirements that are stipulated, failure to carry out post-marketing monitoring, and also failure not to tell the Commission of new scientific or technical information on the safety of the novel food which you may become aware of. So obviously those are the offences, and there are penalties for those offences. So an authorised officer may impose a notice, may impose a fixed monetary penalty, and may issue a compliance notice to secure really that an offence does not continue or reoccur. So finally, really in summary, novel foods legislation has changed, and now novel foods must undergo a standardised, centralised really safety assessment process, which is now more simplified and shorter, before products can be placed on the market. And there is this provision now for notification of traditional foods from third countries. Obviously, novel foods must not differ from common foods ingredients to such an extent that their normal consumption would lead to nutritional deficiencies. And the novel food definition itself is more precise now and more defined with new categories. And the fact that one of the biggest changes obviously is that novel food authorisations are generic, and there is the list which is published in the Union list of all the novel foods that are already authorised. Many thanks for your attention.